thank you all for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here among all the specialists. I'm a generalist, so anyway, that's enough of excuses, but it really is humbling and a privilege to be here with all the specialists today. I am particularly indebted to my co-authors who you see up here, Wendy Lindsay, Joy Mazurek, and especially Alan Phoenix, who did so much to help me and us understand this painting from the Seattle Art Museum collection. Any gaffes in this presentation are mine, not theirs. I also want to make sure that I give sufficient credit to everyone else who helped in the project. As a generalist, I was utterly reliant on the expertise of others, and you can see a long list of people here. I also came down to the Getty for a study day that was co-sponsored by the museum and the Mellon Foundation, and that was a lot of the people who are here presenting today were present at that meeting to look at mural, and that was also extremely eye-opening for me, and lots of direct relevance to the project that I was working on. And of course, Bank of America sponsored this project as one of their conservation grants, so we're very grateful for them. They were very generous, very hands-off, and it was a nice working relationship. I'm almost embarrassed to show this slide after Carol's elegant philosophical kind of explication of the thought process that goes into conservation treatments like this. But this is a slide that I sometimes I threw together and sometimes showed some museology students that we work with in Seattle. And I put it in there because it just It serves as a diagram of the many and varied factors that are borne in consideration as one approaches a conservation treatment. Up on the top of the diagram, there are the kind of organizing principles that go into the creation of a work of art. From the top right, those things that influence the artists themselves and the artist's development over time. Top left, the actual physical materials of the object. Bottom left is the introduction of time and entropy, the inherent vice, mechanical damages through traveling things around, or the environment that influence the actual state of the work of art. And then in the center and the bottom right, you see the process that the conservator engages with, and often in collaboration with curatorial colleagues, to study the object, document the object, and arrive at a plan of action. And that plan of action can be conservation treatment, but it's also stuff like framing and policy around the work of art. We've heard talk today about barriers and things like that. That's all a set of consequences that come out of this whole process. And I would wholeheartedly agree with Carol that as informed as we try and be through this process, there is subjectivity there, inevitably. So anyway, we're going to go down the microscope and look at cross-sections and things, but I want to start by looking at the man himself, because it's Jackson Pollock. We have to do that, right? So I'm going to just escape.
I also use sand, broken glass, pebbles, string, nails, or other foreign matter. A method of painting is the natural growth out of a need. I want to express my feelings rather than illustrate them. Technique is just a means of arriving at a statement. When I am painting, I have a general notion as to what I am about. I can control the flow of the paint. There is no accident, just as there is no beginning and no end. Sometimes I lose a painting, but I have no fear of changes, of destroying the image. Because a painting has a life of its own, I try to let it live.
So in a way, this film is kind of it serves as almost like a mini manifesto of the way the classic Pollock that we all know talking about that direct application. We see him using this pouring and dripping technique. He talks about things like being in the painting, channeling the famous sand painters as if he's accessing something outside himself. But yet he asserts control, which is one of the interesting things about this set of statements. So here's Sea Change. I think that I showed the film because it presents that familiar persona that we have, the classic Pollock idea that we're all familiar with. But a more nuanced appreciation of works that are kind of maybe at the edges of Pollock's artistic output has been done over the last couple of decades. Quite a few of the people in this room and other colleagues have studied these other works, these less classic Pollocks, and I think that this study kind of falls into that group of works and corroborates some of those findings. Sea Change is one of a group of paintings that was a part of a group of paintings that was created in 1947, and they were brought together in a show in 1948 at the Betty Parsons Gallery. And when the Seattle Art Museum curator, Ed Thomas, who was the curator who acquired this painting, first described his first impression of it in late 1954, he already had a good notion of what classic Pollock was. And he said, I thought it was a typical example. It has aluminum paint on it, the gravel, and everything. So that was his approach. And it was a very kind of Seattle moment because he actually saw a rather larger one at Peggy Guggenheim's, but he said that was too big for Seattle, so we'd get the little one instead. So anyway, we're very happy with it. We'll consider materials in a second, but to give you a sense of the physical character, it is not that big. It's about 56 inches by 44 inches wide. So it's a relatively small painting. But what this paper is about is kind of more mainly about that everything, so the non-articulated part of what Thomas saw. When you look closely at this painting, you begin to see marks in addition to the drips and splatters, which were applied in a slightly different way. You realize that there is kind of a perceptible layering in the painting. And there's even, perhaps, it's not too far to say, a kind of disjuncture in the way this painting is layered. Going unnoticed by Thomas, mentioned nowhere in the literature until the examination at MoMA for the show in the 1990s. There is, in fact, a broad palette of vivid colors beneath that network of drips and splashes that we see. And the means of application is different. These colors, as you can see here, are actually applied. You can actually detect brush strokes and direct application methods. So I'm talking about the green, the linear black and aluminium color there. I'm talking about that salmon pink, and then the black and the aluminium are then layered in the drip technique over the top of these things. And more than just the means of application and the palette of the underlying paint, there's another significant factor in that it's actually, in places, we can see that those underlying brushstrokes coalesce into actual forms. And in addition to those kind of linear marks that I'm showing here, there's actually a discernible eye up here. Now, my 6-year-old did not buy that. He said, "Daddy, it's a car." And, but I will contest that the eye is a motif that many of us will be familiar with throughout Pollock's creative output. Here you see it in an early and a very late work. It's up here. I'm not imagining it. And then here. And in fact, it even makes the leap into Lee Krasner's work, and you see it in her work into later, after Pollock's death. And if you look at this detail of the salmon pink and my eye there, and you compare it with a work like the Teacup, which is in the collection in Baden-Baden, you can see that these types of abstracted symbolic forms that we're familiar with from Pollock's work from the 1940s, this is something that has an affinity with what we see underneath the surface of sea change. And there's been quite a lot of work done about how Pollock would sometimes work out of a pre-existing image, so almost as if there's a dialogue with the pre-existing image, because what is apparent when you look at this painting, and I'll show you some examples in a minute, is that he's not just trying to cover it up. He's actually very deliberately and particularly obscuring some brushstrokes, some colors in some places, and revealing others. So unfortunately, I would love to tell you that we did a great analytical project and came up with a fantastic image from underneath this painting, but we didn't. But luckily, I had Alan Phoenix's imagination and skills, and Alan actually put the image into Photoshop, and I think it will help if I show a couple of these images, so decolorizing it first and then starting to add in some of the colors that Alan put back in, isolated and then put back in with Photoshop. And if we black everything else out, I think you can start to see these. This is a continuous salmon pink form, which is emphasized by these blue framing lines and kind of echoing lines. You can see how that follows around the interior of that cavity. And the salmon pink forms go over the top, come down the side, and then there's something that's very difficult to interpret in the middle because it's so densely covered by the overlying marks. So more work to do there. I think that either using real analytical imaging techniques like hyperspectral imaging, or by just doing the hard work of blowing up details and following the forms through where we know that they go underneath drips, we can possibly get better information on those layers and those forms. So moving on. The painting was, as I said, painted for a show in 1948 at Betty Parsons' gallery. But Betty was working, selling Pollock's paintings, in effect, under a kind of contract with Peggy Guggenheim. And Sea Change was one of the works that went unsold at that exhibition, so it went back to Peggy in Venice, and that was where the Seattle Art Museum curator just stopped by on the recommendation of a dealer who was in Seattle, Zoe Duzan, and stopped by to see Peggy, and over dinner she hit it off with Mr. Thomas and ended up giving Seattle Art Museum a painting. So I was very fortunate. It came to Seattle. It was given to Seattle in 1956 and was actually on its way when the artist died. So it came, and who knows whether she had second thoughts after it was shipped out, but she, in the correspondence, you see her saying, well, it should actually be there as a loan for a little while. So it was a loan through 57, and then it came into the museum over 3 years in three gifts in 58, 59, and 60. It traveled through a number of shows. It was featured in this show in the pavilion, in the Seattle Center Pavilion, and was in several landmark shows at the time. And in fact, I'm sorry, I think it's New York seems to have gone into the ocean up there. I apologize for that. But the slide is intended to show that it was actually in 27 different exhibition locations in the years up to 1977. So it was after the close of an exhibition called 200 Years of American Art, organized by the Baltimore Museum. It returned to the States, and it went to Gene Volkmer at MoMA. And Gene was the conservator who was overseeing the travel of these works of art, and the condition of the painting had become a kind of talking point as in the correspondence as the tour progressed through Europe. The pebbles were falling off, the paint was cracking and lifting, and when we look at this photograph that she took prior to her conservation treatment, we really see how flimsy it was. The canvas is actually a rather fine canvas, and the stretcher is it's less than 2 inches thick. It's on backwards, that doesn't help either. And so the painting for the mass and weight of the materials was actually structurally under-supported. You can see here the way that some of the colors were actually, even by 1977, were actually contorting and distorting the canvas as they contracted here on the left. What you see on the right is kind of incidentally interesting as a kind of documentary material, because these markings, there's a large splatter of paint at the bottom, there's this dark staining at the top, and there's also this horizontal marking, which has been suggested may relate to the execution of the painting on the floor, which is possible, because he executed paintings on the floor. In this picture, where you see him with his crow, caw, there's his crow, in this picture you see sea change with the now missing horizontal crossbar in the back of the painting. And in other shots of this, we can actually see some of those other marks, so we know that it's that painting. So, as I mentioned, the surface is covered in gravel. This is gravel that I picked up when I went out there from the gravel pit along the road from Pollock's house. So he was using materials that were freely available to him there. And the mass of that mineral application on the surface, along with these very thick paint layers, many of which are metallic paint layers, and you can see some of these sort of thicker accumulations of paint and layering of paint here, all contributed to the overall fragility of the painting. So here it is before treatment in 77, and here it is before treatment 35 years later. Now, the treatment that Jean elected to do, I want to say that I'm, as Tricia said earlier on, I'm in no way second-guessing the decisions that were made then. This thing was in trouble, and she did exactly what David, has said is a good objective in stabilizing the painting so access can be provided. And she did a really good job at that. It was lined with a wax resin adhesive onto a honeycomb panel, and the work that Jean did to a large extent stabilize the painting. But one of the things that happened then was, actually I'll go back to that for a second, was the application of a B67 varnish. Now, I'll show you some slides of the appearance of it before I started treating it, but that was really, we decided not to do anything about the structural situation with the painting because there really was no need. The driver for this treatment was the removal of the varnish, the technical examination of the painting and the removal of the varnish. And of course, as soon as I decided to do that, Jim Coddington at MoMA started talking about, well, you do know that Pollock was interested in varnishes, don't you? So that gave me pause, but through the dialogue anyway, you'll see why we wanted to remove the varnish in a second, because it had a very prominent and dominating effect on the appearance of the painting. So, having the grant and being able to travel enabled me to go to New York and elsewhere to study paintings. Here's examination of the surface of a slightly later work, of a work that's from this exact same group, Full Fathom 5 at the Museum of Modern Art. I got to go to Venice. Forgive the pigeon picture, it's just to set some context, otherwise we could be anywhere. But I got to go to Venice with the staff from the Getty and the Guggenheim museums to study the works, including Alchemy, which was, again, directly related works, was a fascinating and obviously pleasurable trip. And of course, mural was being worked on here at the Getty at that time, which was an enormously helpful point of comparison for me, as I said about my work. We did not have much technical information when I was starting. It was an objective of this treatment to learn more about the painting, and pretty much all that we had at that point was an X-ray that MoMA had given us, which I believe was taken before the 77 treatment. And in it, again, we could see a little bit about that technique. We could see a little bit of those underlying forms. This is that salmon-colored figure on the right. You can see a little bit more of the shape. And here at the bottom, we can see what I call rectilinear spirals, these shapes here, which appear in other works, like there were 7 in 8 at MoMA. And this was my starting point for the physical object. This was that, in specular light, was that glossy varnish that evened out. It was B67, so we knew from a chemical point of view that this is a varnish that was not going to get any easier to remove over time. So it seemed like a good point to do the study and do the varnish removal. And you can see how it just evens everything out in the surface. Here is a shot before varnish removal. Now, this next shot is emphasized. It's specular light. It actually didn't look this lean and nasty when I removed it, but I'm showing this slide to emphasize the distinction between the earlier brushed paint and the later dripped paint. And Susan showed an interesting work from the earlier 40s where Pollock is starting to work with the drip technique, and it's the same sort of layering. You have this, what we believe is artist oil paint, in these layers, and then we believe that this is a commercial paint that has colophony resin and other components as sort of glossing agents in it. I'll show you a detail later that doesn't look this lean. So this was my surface that I had to work on. I had initially tried to work with lower toxicity solvents. Working with Alan has suggested aromatic, low aromatic naphthalene depleted solvents. But I found it was actually quite difficult to see my progress on this surface because of the reflectivity and the convoluted surface. It was a brutal swab shredder, so I had to develop a technique and here again, I have the highest admiration for Gene Volkmer because there was not a cotton fiber on this painting. And so there probably is now, but I hope they're not obtrusive. So that was really the treatment. It was a relatively simple treatment, and the other major part, but if convoluted and kind of nasty, because I ended up doing it in the spray room with xylene. The second part of the project was the analysis, and as I mentioned, I was very fortunate to have, here you see Alan and Wendy coming up and assisting with the taking of samples. For those of you who are not specialists, we did take samples from this painting. They are very, very small samples. They're going to look massive when you see them, but they're very small samples, all about the size of a period on a regular piece of printed paper. We took 9 samples, and they were predominantly taken from the edges of the painting, where Pollock had dripped some paint, and they were taken from the edges of losses where the pebbles had fallen off. Here you see sample 1 from the center, and the color we were particularly interested in here is the color in the middle, which was this purple. Manganese violet, it was determined to be, and we believe this was an artist paint. It's almost pure magnesium phosphate. What's also interesting in this ultraviolet fluorescence image is how these dripped layers of what we believe to be a commercial paint are not homogeneous in the density of the medium. You can see that there's a greater fluorescence here, and there's less fluorescence at the top of the layer. So that was just something that we observed in these thicker layers on the painting. Also interesting is this very dark band along the bottom, and we're not sure, again, whether that was also carbon. This was all carbon black in the top layer. We're not sure whether that was the edge of a brushed layer or whether that was whether that's some other phenomenon that we're seeing here. By taking more samples, you might be able to determine that, but we didn't want to do that. Here you see that manganese violet and the layering. I think I'll move on to just try and speed up. Cross-section 2, again, you see this beautiful, thick, dripped application. And again, you see this heterogeneous fluorescence in these thicker, dripped layers. In this sample, the salmon pink layers, you see the complexity of the structure, where he repeatedly applies colors one over the previous color. But what was particularly interesting about this sample was this color, this brown color at the top of the sample here. This turned out to be an iron oxide pigment goethite. And this pigment is really interesting because it has a kind of turbid, sort of translucent, poorly covering quality on the surface. And this is one of those points where Pollock went in and actually covered it up quite deliberately. So you see this kind of foliate form here where he traces over the brown to kind of obscure it again after it's been painted on. And then we have these beautiful cross-sections of the aluminium containing paint. And again, you see that thickness of the drip paint. Again, you see that these layers have a settling, and anyone who's repainted their garage roof with metallic paint will know you have to stir that stuff very well to get it into the suspension. And here, even in this dripped application here, we see it settling out. Interestingly here, we also see some spots like this one that was tested where there was very high zinc and carbon, and Alan asked the question of whether this might be the formation of zinc soaps. And there's actually a discrete kind of separation of the layer above this layer. So perhaps we're seeing something like that going on here. And then just wrapping up, drawing to a close, I'm showing a couple of slides of the surface following treatment, where you see the glossy pine resin containing commercial paint against the leaner artist paint. Also, with the removal of the varnish, you could see that there was a greater brilliance of the reflection of the metallic paint. And again, a larger scale detail. We didn't have the back of the painting anymore because it was glued onto, we didn't have the stretcher anyway, because it was glued onto the honeycomb panel. Jean had sent along the area of the stretcher with the artist's signature on it. Now, the Seattle Art Museum never loses anything, but we didn't know where this was. And I'm very pleased to say that during the process of the treatment, this was recovered and is now back on the, it's going back on the new frame. This is the frame that the painting had lived in for the last few years, complete with purple reflections. I'm pleased to say that although, again, this provided excellent protection for the painting, we felt that with such a subtle treatment where we wanted to talk about issues like surface quality, we felt it was impossible to put it back into this frame. So I spoke with some of you here, Brad and others, about the character of a replacement frame, and we ended up going with a very simple molding frame, which I think doesn't wrestle with the artist's intent, even if it doesn't exactly copy what he did. And there you see in detail, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your patience.